This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang has said during his first press conference that China would pursue a sound and stable relationship with the U.S., but warned that there will surely be conflict and confrontation if the U.S. does not hit the brake in the wrong way of handling the relations. What's the next stage of China-U.S. relationship going to, and what are China's diplomatic priorities for this year? And as financial and geopolitical uncertainties are on the rise around the globe, how does the world's second largest economy view its role? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined by Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy, Harvey Dzodin, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Founder and President at the Schiller Institute. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. Let's start with China-U.S. relations, probably the most important relationship in the world. Zhao Hai, we'll start with you. One of the focuses, I would say, of the press conference is this bilateral relationship. The foreign minister compared the relationship to two athletes competing in an Olympic race where one tries to trip or injure the other instead of focusing on giving one's best. And that this is not fair competition, but a malicious confrontation and a foul. Obviously, China is not happy with the way the U.S. handles the relationship. So unfair competition, how will that affect these bilateral ties?
Well, I think Foreign Minister Qin Gang has made a very excellent case describing what's going on between the two countries right now. The U.S. is using a variety of tools trying to contain China and to prevent China from developing its high tech further. And this is very much like the Olympic game. And I think it's also very important to point out that the United States is not only trying to slow down China, but also, like Foreign Minister Qin Gang pointed out, trying to kick China out of the Olympic game into the Paralympic game. So that means to cripple China and to further weaken China's potential of future growth, meaning that in the future, the United States will prevent China from challenging its leadership in the world. So I think in the future, it's very difficult to handle this relationship because the U.S. is starting from the wrong point, meaning that the first button is wrong, and therefore the following buttons will also be in the wrong place. And therefore, in order to correct that, the United States first need to have a correct strategic understanding of China's future development goals. And without a correct understanding and without paying more attention to China's development goals and China's specified goals towards this bilateral relationship, they will not discover the right way to deal with China, including how to cooperate with China in the many important areas like climate change, like public health policies, and also many other areas that the two countries need to work together to meet the challenge.
Well, Harvey, the U.S. describes the China-U.S. relationship as a competitive one with confrontation and little cooperation. If that's the case, of course, the U.S. would say, we want to win this competition. But what does a win mean in specific terms?
Such a good question. And I'm so depressed about what's gone on since the balloon incident, because the relations have gone from bad to worse, Xinduo. So I think to America, winning means there's only one number one country, hegemon, whatever you want to call it, and that's the United States of America. We've fallen so far from 10 years ago when President Xi and President Obama met in California, and President Xi proposed to President Obama a new model of great power relations. And one of the first attempts, and maybe the last attempts at that, was that U.S. and China cooperated to bring about the Paris Climate Agreement. But after that came Trump, and after that came Biden. And so I see America sees this, what's going on now, as a zero-sum game. And I think it's a recipe for disaster. And I think we're walking into the Thucydides trap, where a rising nation like China is challenging an established nation, a pattern that's existed since ancient Greece. And I really worry about that. And I think it's no wonder that the Union of Atomic Scientists have set their doomsday clock, 75-year-old doomsday clock, at 90 seconds to midnight, from 90 seconds to Armageddon, the closest it's ever been. And I really worry, and I think we need to get back on track to dialogue and to treating each other as equals and as partners as well as competitors. We can compete, but we can also cooperate.
Mm-hmm. Ms. LaRouche, if you look at the relationship, of course, the U.S. is concerned with the continuous rise of China, development of China. But then, if you look at the Chinese development, it's really about, for example, Belt and Road, more investment in infrastructure, more trade, and more personnel exchanges between countries. It's about the cooperation. It's not somehow like a goal to replace the U.S. or to become number one. What's the impact of, let's say, worsening or problematic relationship between the two largest economies?
Well, I think that the problem is that the neoliberal system is facing basically major problems. After 2008, nothing was done to remedy the root causes of the systemic crisis, which it was already then. And because of the pumping of trillions of dollars in the years since, we are now looking at a hyperinflation, and the central banks are shifting between quantitative tightening to try to fight the inflation and quantitative easing to avoid a series of collapse. So I think what is behind this accelerated confrontation is the fact that, despite COVID, the Chinese economy is doing well. The growth of China is indispensable for the world economy. If you would take the Chinese model out of the equation, out of the world economic situation, the world would be in a terrible condition with COVID, with the hunger, and the war dynamic, in my view, comes from the fact that the neoliberal transatlantic system is actually experiencing a systemic crisis. And from that standpoint, the rise of not only China, but of all of Asia is regarded as a threat. And I think the existence of mankind will depend on the ability of a chorus of countries, especially from the global south, to try to make their voice heard, that there must not be a contradiction between the rise of China and the United States and Europe. I think we have to all work together to get all the countries to work together and stop this confrontation. And I can only agree, the doomsday clock has never been closer, and we have never been as close to the danger of nuclear extinction as now. So I think we are really called upon all as the one humanity. China is always, or Xi Jinping in particular, is talking about the shared community of the joint future, because we only have one future. Nobody can win a nuclear war. So I think it's really the biggest challenge mankind has ever faced.
Mm-hmm. Well, Harvey, picking up on what you have said earlier, U.S. is trying to win a competition with China, or at what cost? We know what's happening over Taiwan, the problematic visit by former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and probably more, visit by U.S. officials from the Congress. And then, what's the bottom line? So is the U.S. preparing for a conflict in Asia?
I think that the U.S. is doing so. I think that they're really the government is driving the country into a direct confrontation with China. China's not going to take it. I've seen from what the foreign minister said from President Xi has said during the two sessions that we're heading in that direction. And I think it's really unfortunate. I think part of this stems from America's fascination with having been number one since 1945 and is unwilling to share with other countries. But share it must, because we have other powerful countries in the world, not only economically powerful, but also politically powerful and powerful in terms of their influence and cooperation with other countries. So I think if the U.S. is headed towards war, we're headed towards extinction, unfortunately. And in spite of that, I think the U.S. has been blinded. So to the fact that we need to work together on several existential issues that we've already touched on. So one of them is the nuclear issue that Helga pointed out, and arms control as well, arms control in space and on the Earth, the environment, global public health. We're shouting at each other. We're not working with each other. And so I think it's very important for the U.S. and other countries, for that matter, to try to start working on existential issues that we can all unite on. But the U.S. doesn't seem to be going there. Look at the balloon incident. What Biden should have done is made sure that Blinken went to China and discussed this issue, not use it as a pretext to blow this thing out of all proportion. We know that all the major countries and some others use a lot of intelligence from space and from balloons and other means. So what's going on here? It was just a great excuse for America to stick it in China's eye rather than talk about the larger issue. That's what we should be doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhao Hai, speaking of the balloon incident, I mean, even U.S. government acknowledged that there's no any kind of like military challenge or threat to the U.S. security. Mm-hmm. But still, it has been one of the biggest issue probably in terms of like anti-China rhetoric and the sentiment over there. Of course, domestic politics. Somehow, they say Biden government can't afford to appear to be soft on China, but then at the expense of China-U.S. relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from technical perspective, the DoD has said that it's not a real threat to U.S. national security, and China has ample means to discover whatever the balloon can discover. So, of course, that's not an issue. The issue, as Foreign Minister Qin Gang pointed out, is U.S. domestic politics, and they're playing politics against each other to show which one is tougher on China. So at this point, that's why U.S.-China relationship right now is so difficult, because no matter what China does, the other side always think the worst case scenario and always deal with China from that worst case scenario. And therefore, it's very hard to convince them what's the right mind should be and how to avoid this zero-sum game or Cold War mindset. And I think to step back further, and if you think deeper about China-U.S. relationship in the recent years, what happened is that this continuous Western universalism and American exceptionalism that are both at play now to support U.S. hegemony around the world. And that's why China is offering a different idea, which is called Chinese modernization, saying that there are different trajectories, different ways, path towards modernization, and the West does not monopolize modernization. And the Chinese and many other countries, developing countries modernizing itself, it's just a prelude to a concert with many more countries catching up to the modernization. So that's one. And the other thing is that Americans believe they have a manifest destiny, and they are the only country fit to rule the world, so-called Pax Americana. Today's reality is that the world is moving towards a multipolar system, and democratization of international relations is unavoidable. So without the U.S. itself realizing where the world is really going, understand the reality on the ground, and they continue to have this fantasy that somehow they can continue to rule the world with its a very small number of allies, then the world will continue to have conflict rather than having political dialogue to resolve the issues through dialogue and through taking care of each other's concerns and respect each other. So again, I think only return to what China has proposed, mutual respect, a peaceful coexistence and win-win cooperation can China-U.S. relations restore its rationality and put it back on track. And rather, right now, the U.S. emphasizes on competition, even it's not really competition, it's confrontation already. And as this press conference pointed out, that the U.S. side is actually accelerating on that path. And whatever guardrail they're proposing to establish will ultimately be break down by that force. So again, this is a cautious call for everybody, every party concerned, everybody who has an interest in this very important bilateral relationship, to really step back and re-examine this relationship and find out the right way moving forward, as President Xi called for.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have mentioned there's quite a lot to unpack. We'll come back on that. Well, here we have Helga. The issue is from the Chinese point of view, there's a lack of rationality, from the U.S. side. For example, when they talk about building guardrails or not seeking conflict, as said by President Biden. But if you look at the policy on China, it's quite provocative. Basically endless entity list by including the Chinese high-tech companies, using coercive measures over there, and also, for example, the One China principle or One China policy. As the U.S. said, they are basically abandoning that kind of guardrail. That's probably the most fundamental guardrail to ensure there is a stable relationship between the two countries. What's your comment on that?
Well, I think that there is a hardening in the U.S. policy. It has been building up actually since 91, when the Soviet Union disintegrated. There was the chance to have a peace policy because there was no more enemy in quotes. But then the NATO expansions occurred, and color revolution, regime change, and gradually the policy became more and more towards the idea of unipolar world based on the Anglo-American special relationship. We should not forget the role of the British in all of that. So, right now, I think it's almost like moving towards an end game, because, I don't think that this situation is going to last forever. You have Europe right now, which is being pressured to decouple from China. Now, that's completely impossible. After the US forced Europe, and especially Germany, to impose, I think the EU imposed 10 rounds of sanctions against Russia, the relationship between Europe and Russia is completely destroyed. And if you now would force Europe to also decouple from China, it would basically mean a complete deindustrialization of Europe. So one can only hope that the Europeans find their self-interest and realize that they could be a voice of reason. Now, I have been thinking a lot how to remedy this really terrible situation. And the only thing I could think of is that if the European countries would really take care of their own interests and have a reasonable relationship with China and work with the global South, because the global South is definitely on the rise. You have Foreign Minister Lavrov said in India that this is the global majority, and that's actually true, because if you look at the BRICS, of which China is a very important part, it's now the BRICS Plus. 24 countries have applied for full membership in the BRICS. So that's the overwhelming majority of the human species. Now, if the global South would ally with European countries, and they would basically put in their voice as a voice of peace, and insist that there should be a response to the Chinese proposals, which I think are the most advanced diplomatic proposals anybody made, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, as a framework to move to a new security architecture, because it's very clear that the present security architecture does not function anymore. NATO should have been dissolved when the Warsaw Pact dissolved. They did not. They decided to become the force of a US hegemon instead. But this is now reaching a limit. And I think what is very urgently needed is that the countries of the global South, the global majority, as I would like to really also name them, would join with China to put the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative on the table as a demand, because they have a right to have a voice. The global majority is the majority of mankind, so they should become a much more stronger factor in the diplomatic equation.
Well, speak of that, Harvey, if you look at the opinions, for example, for Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN countries, like from Singapore, their officials are making clear that they will not be part of the proxy war if there's one in Asia, and they will not be bullied or bought, and they are not choosing sides among superpowers. And Malaysia, their new prime minister, is making clear that 9 of the ASEAN countries should have foreign troops on their soil. So you see the majority, probably the countries from the global south, is focusing on development, trade, investment, instead of the competition with each other or choosing sides either with the U.S. or with other countries here. And so, in terms of number, that's the majority, just like Helga pointed out, right, Harvey?
Well, I think that's as it should be. So I think the world's coming to see this picture more clearly. And so we see unmistakable signs of the global south and to some lesser extent, the EU thinking about changing direction. So the global south that's often gotten the short end of the stick as it did during COVID relief, and it's increasingly making its displeasure known and thinking of an alternative which means working with China and other countries, the BRICS countries, for example. And although they're not obviously part of the global south, at some point you have to talk about the EU. I believe that at some point the EU is not going to be the lapdog of the U.S. anymore, but it's going to exercise more strategic autonomy. I think that the EU has this potential. I was actually hopeful when the U.S. forced this nanochip ban on China and other countries supplying China, that several EU countries like the Netherlands were going to push back. All they did was express their displeasure until they were muzzled by the U.S. But I think it's a sign that the strategic differences are coming to the fore and that there will be strategic autonomy. And I don't know that the U.S. sees this or cares to see it or doesn't want to see it, but it's happening. And I think the sooner that they get with the program and trying to find a way for global cooperation rather than for global division, we'll have a chance of being here in a generation or even maybe next year.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhao Hai, you mentioned about the global south. Interestingly, I think right after China made this peace plan, 12-point peace plan on the occasion of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the 1 year anniversary. So I think it's Ian Bremmer, the chairman or the founder of Eurasia Group, said that this peace plan could come from any member of the global south. What do you make of that comment? Basically, he said that this peace plan, not only from China, but also from the big community of the global south or the developing countries.
Yeah, I think on that particular point, he's correct. And if you look at what happened in the United Nations, it's a very good indicator how global south, and even more than that, I think the majority of the UN countries have a very clear sense of what's right and what's wrong. And the U.S. also just has a double standard on that issue. For instance, there's a vote on Ukraine, and then there's 140 plus votes to support Ukraine. But at the same time, there's 180 plus votes to support Cuba and calling on the U.S. to cancel Cuba sanctions. And also there's also 180 some plus countries voted to stand, to support Palestine. So I think in many, many issues, United Nations have spoken, but the U.S. only pick one story and repeat that story, trying to make that, pick whatever that support their argument. So again, Global South's voice, Foreign Minister Qin Gang pointed out, need to be louder. and need a microphone that to replace the current mainstream Western media that continue to turn out their point of view, rather ignoring the need and the reality of Global South. So in that respect, I think China proposed Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, just to answer to the call. And it's just not China's own position, it's actually a common denominator for all the countries in the Global South and BRIC countries in particular, because all those big developing countries have their national interest to defend, have their sovereignty and territorial integrity to defend, and also have their aspiration for a higher standard of living. So moving forward, I think it's very important on that particular issue of Ukraine. All those global countries, global South countries maintain neutrality and continue to push for peace. And that's the only hope that we can peacefully resolve this issue through political dialogue, through serious negotiations, rather than through supplying weapons all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Helga, Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang also discussed the China-EU relations. He said, China hopes that Europe, quote, with the painful Ukraine crisis in mind, will realize strategic autonomy and long-term peace and stability. Obviously, the Chinese side understands the concerns of the European countries in terms of the Ukraine crisis. And also, we are expecting the arrival in Beijing by the European leaders, political leaders, for example, President of France and other senior and also leaders of European nations very soon. So what can we expect in terms of China-EU relationship?
Well, I think that it's very hopeful. Macron, for example, plans to come to China in April. And I think, if I would be China, I would make more initiatives towards Europe, because Europe is under incredible pressure from the United States, from Great Britain, from NATO, and I think we need, and this has also been the case for China, that there is a new open tone. China has published its view about the US hegemony, which is very harsh in its wording, and I would suggest that the same should be done in respect to Russia, because right now, the Western narrative is that they always talk about the unprovoked aggression of Russia. But, there are many military experts in Europe right now, like Jacques Beau, who is a famous Swiss analyst, who points to the fact that the US Congress had sponsored several hearings, and that there were 4 international conferences in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, who all had the subject to completely smash Russia into many different states. Then there was also several meetings in December in the Jamestown Foundation and the Hudson Institute, where they discussed to cut Russia into many different states. Now, if I would be in Russia's shoes, I would take this serious, because it goes along with all kinds of practical steps. So is the Russian view paranoid, or is it truthful? And I think this question of who controls the narrative about Ukraine, this is something which should not be left to a few countries, not even to the Europeans and the Americans. I think historians are called, and journalists, people like Seymour Hersh, for example, who have added something to the discussion. I mean, we are on the verge of World War III. So what are people afraid of? People should be more afraid that this whole thing goes completely out of control and we all will be dead, like some of the previous 2 speakers have indicated. And that requires that we need people to have the courage to come forward and say, no, that there are ideas to smash Russia into many pieces. And what Russia did, nobody likes war, but it's not so simple. It's not black and white.
Right.
And therefore, I think I would really hope that when Macron comes, and Scholz was there before, that there would be more understanding in this direction.
Mm-hmm. And more talk about peace rather than war. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thanks for being with us. I'm Xu Xindu. See you next time.